Testing. Oh my God. Yes, mister, if you're still there, I apologize. For some reason, OBS shut off my mic. I really hope I have not. I really hope I have not been talking this whole freaking time with no audio. I really hope that's not the case. Let me test that out. Hmm. Well, hmm. Oh my God. I may have been. Oh God. Is there any way I can go back on this? Son of a. Let me see now. Checking out my channel. That's very odd. Oh, son of a. I have been talking this whole freaking time for hours. Oh, good God. This was stupid. Scuffed. Scuffed. Hour and a half. A scuff. Ah, mod. Damn it, mods. Uh, I shouldn't blame them. I apologize. Oh my God. Oof. That was really dumb. Chat, I'm dumb. Oh, good God. The hell with it. Oh, Chat, this is why I'm not a professional streamer. All right. We are starting over. Oh, Jesus. Okay. All right. We are going to actually read a story now. That way you will actually be able to hear me. And it is called The Street. Oh, boy. Before I start that, I'm going to take a drink of water because I've been talking for an hour and a half about a drink of water. And nobody's able to hear me but myself. Because OBS inexplicably shut off my microphone. we go. Enjoy that professional note and disclaimer. This video is getting cut down. The Street. The Street was written in late 1919, shortly after The White Ship. Although superficially a realistic story, it may also reveal the influence of Lord Dunsay, particularly in the war parables in Tales of War, 1919. Lovecraft noted that the story was inspired by the Boston police strike, which lasted from September 8, 1919, until well into October. Lovecraft's own tale is a somewhat xenophobic allegory about the overrunning of America by seditious immigrants, and therefore does not rank high in his output. It was first published in The Wolverine, December 1920. There be those who say that things and places have souls, and there be those that say they have not. I dare not say myself, but I will tell of the street. Men of strength and honor fashioned that street good, valiant men of our blood who had come from the blessed isles across the sea. At first it was but a path trodden by bearers of water, from the woodland spring to the cluster of houses by the beach. Then, as more men came out to the growing cluster of houses and looked about for places to dwell, they built cabins along the north side, cabins of stout oaken logs with masonry on the side toward the forest, for many Indians lurked there with fire arrows, and in a few years more men built cabins on the south side of the street. Up and down the street walked grave men in conical hats, who most of the time carried muskets or fowling pieces. And there were also their bonneted wives and sober children. In the evening these men with their wives and children would sit about gigantic hearths and read and speak. Very simple were the things of which they read and spoke, yet things which gave them courage and goodness and helped them by day to subdue the forest and till the fields. And the children would listen and learn of the laws and deeds of old, and of that dear England which they had never seen or could not remember. There was war, and thereafter no more Indians troubled the street. The men, busy with labor, waxed prosperous and as happy as they knew how to be. And the children grew up comfortably, and more families came from the motherland to dwell on the street. And the children's children and the newcomers' children grew up. The town was now a city, and one by one the cabins gave place to houses, simple, beautiful houses of brick and wood, with stone steps and iron railings and fan lights over the doors. No flimsy creations were these houses, for they were made to serve many a generation. Within there were carven mantels and graceful stairs and sensible, pleasing furniture, china and silver, brought from the motherland. So the street drank in the dreams of a young people and rejoiced as its dwellers became more graceful and happy. Where once had been only strength and honor, taste and learning now abode as well. Books and paintings and music came to the houses, and the young men went to the university which rose above the plain to the north. In the place of conical hats and muskets there were 3 cornered hats and small swords, and lace and snowy periwigs, and there were cobblestones o'er which clattered many a blooded horse and rumbled many a gilded coach, and brick sidewalks with horse blocks and hitching posts. There were in that street many trees, elms and oaks and maples of dignity, so that in the summer the scene was all soft verdure and twittering bird song, and behind the houses were walled rose gardens with hedged paths and sundials. where at evening the moon and stars would shine bewitchingly, while fragrant blossoms glistened with dew. So the street dreamed on, past wars, calamities, and changes. Once most of the young men went away, and some never came back. That was when they furled the old flag and put up a new banner of stripes and stars. But though men talked of great changes, the street felt them not, for its folk were still the same, speaking of the old familiar things in the old familiar accents. And the trees still sheltered singing birds, and at evening the moon and stars looked down upon the dewy blossoms in the walled rose gardens. In time there were no more swords, three-cornered hats, or periwigs in the street. How strange seems the denizens with their walking sticks, tall beavers, and cropped heads. New sounds came from the distance, first strange puffings and shrieks from a river a mile away, and then many years later, strange puffings and shrieks and rumblings from other directions. The air was not quite so pure as before, but the spirit of the place had not changed. The blood and soul of the people were as the blood and soul of their ancestors who had fashioned the street. Nor did the spirit change when they tore open the earth to lay down strange pipes, or when they set up tall posts bearing weird wires. There was so much ancient lore in that street that the past could not easily be forgotten. Then came days of evil, when many who had known the street of old knew it no more, and many knew it who had not known it before, and those who came were never as close as those who went away, for their accents were coarse and strident, and their mien and faces unappealing. Their thoughts, too, fought with the wise, the just spirit of the street, so that the street pined silently as its houses fell into decay, and the trees died one by one, and its rose gardens grew rank with weeds and waste. But it felt a stir of pride one day when again marched forth young men, some of whom never came back. These young men were clad in blue. With the years, worse fortune came to the street. Its trees were all gone now, and its rose gardens were displaced by the backs of cheap, ugly new buildings on parallel streets. Yet the houses remained, despite the ravages of the years and the storms and worms, for they had been made to serve many a generation. New kinds of faces appeared in the street, swarthy, sinister faces with furtive eyes and odd features, whose owners spoke unfamiliar words and placed signs in known and unknown characters upon most of the musty houses. Push carts crowded the gutters. A sordid, undefinable stench settled over the place, and the ancient spirit slept. Great excitement once came to the street. War and revolution were raging across the seas. A dynasty had collapsed, and its degenerate subjects were flocking with dubious intent to the western land. Many of these took lodgings in the battered houses that had once known the songs of birds and the scent of roses. Then the western land itself awoke, and joined the motherland in her titanic struggle for civilization. Over the cities once more floated the old flag, companioned by the new flag, and by a plainer yet glorious tricolor. But not many flags floated over the street, for therein brooded only fear and hatred and ignorance. Again young men went forth, but not quite as did the young men of the other days. Something was lacking, and the sons of those young men of other days, who did indeed go forth in olive drab, with the true spirit of their ancestors, went from distant places and knew not the street and its ancient spirit. Over the seas there was a great victory, and in triumph most of the young men returned. Those who had lacked something lacked it no longer. Yet did Yet did fear and hatred and ignorance still brood over the street, for many had stayed behind, and many strangers had come from distant places to the ancient houses, and the young men who had returned dwelt there no longer. Swarthy and sinister were most of the strangers, yet among them one might find a few faces like those who fashioned the street and molded its spirit, like and yet unlike, for there was in the eyes of all weird, unearthed, unhealthy glitter as of greed, ambition, vindictiveness, or misguided zeal. Unrest and treason were abroad among an evil few who plotted to strike the western land its death blow, that they might mount to power over its ruins, even as assassins had mounted in that unhappy frozen land from whence most of them had come, and the heart of that plotting was in the street, whose crumbling houses teemed with alien makers of discord and echoed with the plans and speeches of those who yearned for the appointed day of blood, flame, and crime. Of the various old assemblages in the street, the law said much, but could provide little. With great diligence did men of hidden badges linger and listen about such places as Petrovich's Bakery, the squalid Rifkin School of Modern Economics, the Circle Social Club, and the Liberty Cafe. There were congregated sinister men in great numbers, yet always was their speech guarded or in a foreign tongue. And still the old houses stood, with their forgotten lore of nobler departed centuries, of sturdy colonial tenants and dewy rose gardens in the moonlight. Sometimes a lone poet or traveler would come to view them, and would try to picture them in their vanished glory. Yet of such travelers and poets there were not many. The rumor now spread widely that these houses contained the leaders of a vast band of terrorists, who on a designated day were to launch an orgy of slaughter for the extermination of America and for all the fine old traditions which the street had loved. Handbills and papers fluttered about filthy gutters, handbills and papers printed in many tongues and in many characters, yet all bearing messages of crime and rebellion. In these writings the people were urged to tear down the laws and virtues that our fathers had exalted, to stamp out the soul of the old America, the soul that was bequeathed through 1,500 years of Anglo-Saxon freedom, justice, and moderation. It was said that the swart men who dwelt in the street had congregated in its rotting edifices were the brains of a hideous revolution, that at their word of command many millions of brainless, besotted beasts would stretch forth their noisome talons from the slums of 1,000 cities, burning and slaying and destroying till the land of our fathers should be no more. As this was said and repeated, many looked forward in dread to the 4th day of July, about which the strange writings hinted much, yet could nothing be found to place the guilt. None could tell whose arrest might cut off the damnable plotting at its source. Many times came bands of blue-coated police to search the shaky houses, though at last they ceased to come, for they too had grown tired of law and order, and had abandoned all the city to its fate. Then men in olive drab came, bearing muskets, till it seemed as if in its sad sleep the street must have some haunting dreams of those other days, when musket-bearing men in conical hats walked along from the woodland spring to the cluster of houses by the beach. Yet could no act be performed to check the impeding cataclysm, for the swart, sinister men were old and cunning. So the street slept uneasily on, till one night there gathered in Petrovich's Bakery and the Rifkin School of Modern Economics and the Circle Social Club and the Liberty Cafe, and in other places as well, vast hordes of men whose eyes were big with horrible triumph and expectation. Over hidden wires strange messages traveled, and much was said of still stranger messages yet to travel. But most of this was not guessed till afterward, when the western land was safe from peril, The men in olive drab could not tell what was happening, or what they ought to do, for the swart, sinister men were skilled in subtlety and concealment. And yet the men in olive drab will always remember that night, and will speak of the street as they tell of it to their grandchildren, for many of them were sent there toward morning on a mission unlike that which they had expected. It was known that this nest of anarchy was old, and that the houses were tottering from the ravages of the years and the storms and the worms. Yet was the happening of that summer night a surprise because of its very queer uniformity. It was indeed an exceedingly singular happening, though after all a simple one, for without warning in one of the small hours beyond midnight, all the ravages of the years and the storms and the worms came to a tremendous climax, and after the crash there was nothing left standing in the street, save two ancient chimneys and part of a stout brick wall. Nor did anything that had been alive come alive from the ruins. A poet and a traveler who came with the mighty crowd that sought the scene tell odd stories. The poet says that all through the hours before dawn he beheld sordid ruins, but indistinctly in the glare of the arc lights that were loomed above the wreckage, another picture wherein he could descry moonlight and fair houses and elms and oaks and maples of dignity. And the traveler declares that instead of the place's wonted stench, there lingered a delicate fragrance as of roses in full bloom. But not the dreams of poets and the tales of travelers, but are not the dreams of poets and the tales of travelers notoriously false? There be those who say that things and places have souls, and there be those who say that they have not. I dare not say myself, but I have told you of the street. It's pretty, what do we say, racist? Yeah, well, just a little xenophobic. Apparently, he was anti-immigration, or at least mass immigration. Okay, because this one's actually good, I'm going to reread The Tomb, since nobody was able to hear it. So let me adjust this. All right, this one is good. The first story written upon his resumption of fiction writing in the summer of 1917. The Tomb is one of Lovecraft's most Poe-esque tales. He noted that the inspiration of the tale was a walk through a Providence cemetery, where he saw an old tombstone dating to 1711, date actually used in the story, and wondered, why could I not talk with him, and enter more intimately into the life of my chosen age? The poem included in the story was written at an earlier date. The existing manuscript bears the title Gaudemus, meaning let us delight, and is a surprising instance of a drinking song written by a teetotaler. The story first appeared in The Vagrant, March 1922. Sedibus ut saltum placidis in morte quiscam. Virgil. In relating to the circumstances which have led to my confinement within this refuge for the demented, I am aware that my present position will create a natural doubt in the authenticity of my narrative. It is an unfortunate fact that the bulk of humanity is too limited in its mental vision to weigh with patience and intelligence those isolated phenomena seen and felt only by a psychologically sensitive few, which lie outside its common experience. Men of broader intellect know that there is no sharp distinction betwixt the real and the unreal, that all things appear as they do only by virtue of the delicate individual physical and mental media through which we are made conscious of them. but the prosaic materialism of the majority condemns as madness the flashes of supersight which penetrate the common veil of obvious empiricism. My name is Jervis Dudley, and from earliest childhood I have been a dreamer and a visionary, wealthy beyond the necessity of a commercial life, and temperamentally unfitted for the formal studies and social recreations of my acquaintances. I have dwelt ever in realms apart from the visible world, spending my youth and adolescence in ancient and little-known books, and in roaming the fields and groves of the region near my ancestral home. I do not think that what I read in these books or saw in these fields and groves was exactly what other boys read and saw there. But of this I must say little, since detailed speech would but confirm those cruel slanders upon my intellect, which I sometimes overhear from the whispers of the stealthy attendants around me. It is sufficient for me to relate events without analyzing causes. I have said that I dwelt apart from this visible world, but I have not said that I dwelt alone. This no human creature may do, for lacking the fellowship of the living, he inevitably draws upon the companionship of things that are not. Eight 3773. Thank you for the follow. Or are no longer living. Close to my home there lies a singular wooded hollow, in whose twilight deeps I spend most of my time, reading, thinking, and dreaming. Down its moss-covered slopes my first steps of infancy were taken, and around its grotesquely gnarled oak trees my first fancies of boyhood were woven. Well did I come to know this presiding dryads of those trees, and often have I watched their wild dances in the struggling beams of a waning moon. But of these things I must not now speak. I will tell only of the lone tomb in the darkest of the hillside thickets, the deserted tomb of the Hydes, an old and exalted family whose last direct descendant had been laid within its black recesses many decades before my birth. The vault to which I refer is of ancient granite, weathered and discolored by the mists and dampness of generations. Excavated back into the hillside, the structure is visible only at the entrance. The door, a ponderous and forbidding slab of stone, hangs upon rusted iron hinges, and is fastened ajar in a queerly sinister way by means of heavy iron chains and padlocks, according to a gruesome fashion of half a century ago. The abode of the race whose scions are here interned had once crowned the declivity which holds the tomb, but had long since fallen victim to the flames which sprang up from a disastrous stroke of lightning. Of the midnight storm which destroyed this gloomy mansion, the older inhabitants of the region sometimes speak in hushed and uneasy voices, alluding to what they call divine wrath, in a manner that in later years vaguely increased the always strong fascination which I felt for the forest-darkened sepulchre. One man only had perished in the fire. When the last of the Hydes was buried in this place of shade and stillness, the sad urnful of ashes had come from a distant land, to which the family had repaired when the mansion burned down. No one remains to lay flowers before the granite portal, and few care to brave the depressing shadows which seem to linger strangely about the water-worn stones. I shall never forget the afternoon when I first stumbled upon the half-hidden house of death. It was in midsummer, when the alchemy of nature transmutes the sylvan landscape to one vivid and almost homogeneous mass of green, when the senses are well nigh intoxicated with the surging seas of moist verdure, and the subtly indefinable odors of the soil and the vegetation, in which surroundings the mind loses its perspective, time and space become trivial and unreal, and echoes of a forgotten prehistoric past beat insistently upon the enthralled consciousness. All day I had been wandering through the mystic groves of the hollow, thinking thoughts I need not discuss, and conversing with things I need not name. In years a child of 10, I had seen and heard many wonders unknown to the throng, and was oddly aged in certain respects, when upon forcing my way between two savage clumps of briars, I suddenly encountered the entrance of the vault. I had no knowledge of what I had discovered. The dark blocks of granite, the door so curiously ajar, and the funeral carvings above the arch aroused in me no associations of mournful or terrible character. Of graves and tombs I knew and imagined much, but had, on account of my peculiar temperament, been kept from all personal contact with churchyards and cemeteries. The strange stone house, the woodland slope, was to me only a source of interest and speculation, and its old, damp interior, into which I vainly peered through the aperture so tantalizingly left, contained for me no hint of death or decay. But in that instant of curiosity was born the madly unreasoning desire which has brought me to this hell of confinement. Spurred on by a voice which must have come from the hideous soul of the forest, I resolved to enter the beckoning gloom in spite of the ponderous chains which barred my passage. In the waning light of day I alternately rattled the rusty impediments with a view to throwing wide the stone door, and essayed to squeeze my slight form through a space already provided, but neither plan met with success. At first curious, I was not frantic, and when in the thickening twilight I returned to my home, I had sworn to the 100 gods of the grove that at any cost I would some day force an entrance to the black, chilly depths that seemed calling out to me. The physician with the iron-gray beard who comes each day to my room once told a visitor that this decision marked the beginning of a pitiful monomania. But I will leave final judgment to my readers when they shall have learnt all. The months following my discovery were spent in futile attempts to force the complicated padlock of the slightly open vault, and in carefully guarded inquiries regarding the nature and history of the structure. With the traditionally receptive ears of a small boy, I learned much, though habitual secretiveness caused me to tell no one of my information or my resolve. It is perhaps worth mentioning that I was not at all surprised or terrified on learning of the nature of the vault. My rather original ideas regarding life and death had caused me to associate the cold clay with the breathing body in a vague fashion, and I felt that the great and sinister family of the burned-down mansion was in some way represented within the stone space I sought to explore. Mumbled tales of the weird rites and godless revels of bygone years in the ancient hall gave to me a new and potent interest in the tomb, before whose door I would sit for hours at a time each day. I once thrust a candle within the nearly closed entrance, but I could see nothing save a flight of damp stone steps leading downward. The odor of the place repelled, yet bewitched me. I felt I had known it before, in a past remote beyond all recollection, beyond even my tenacity of the body I now possess. The year after I first beheld the tomb, I stumbled upon a worm-eaten translation of Plutarch's Lives in the book-filled attic of my home. Reading the life of Theseus, I was much impressed by that passage telling of the great stone beneath which the boyish hero was to find his tokens of destiny whenever he should become old enough to lift its enormous weight. This legend had the effect of dispelling my keenest impatience to enter the vault, for it made me feel that the time was not yet ripe. Later I told myself I should grow to a strength and ingenuity which might enable me to unfasten the heavily chained door with ease. But until then I would do better by conforming to what seemed the will of fate. Accordingly, my watches by the dank portal became less persistent, and much of my time was spent in other, though equally strange, pursuits. I would sometimes rise very quietly into the night, stealing out to walk in those churchyards and places of burial from which I had been kept by my parents. What I did there I may not say, for I am not now sure of the reality of certain things, but I know that on the day after such a nocturnal rumble, I would often astonish those about me with my knowledge of topics almost forgotten for many generations. It was after a night like this that I shocked the community with a queer conceit about the burial of the rich and celebrated Squire Brewster, a maker of local history, who was interred in 1711, and whose slate headstone, bearing a graven skull and crossbones, was slowly crumbling to power. In a moment of childish imagination, I vowed not only that the undertaker, Goodman Simpson, had stolen the silver-buckled shoes, silken hose, and satin small-clothes of the deceased before burial, but that the squire himself, not fully inanimate, had turned twice in his mound-covered coffin on the day after interment. But the idea of entering the tomb never left my thoughts, being indeed stimulated by the unexpected genealogical discovery that my own maternal ancestry possessed at least a slight link with the supposedly extinct family of the Hydes, last of my paternal race. I was likewise the last of this older and more mysterious line. I began to feel that the tomb was mine, and to look forward with hot eagerness to the time when I might press within that stone door and down those slimy stone steps in the dark. I now formed the habit of listening very intently at the slightly open portal, choosing my favorite hours of midnight stillness for the odd vigil. By the time I came of age, I had made a small clearing in the thicket before the mold-stained facade of the hillside, allowing the surrounding vegetation to encircle and overhang the space, like the walls and roof of a sylvan bower. This bower was my temple, the fastened door my shrine, and here I would lie outstretched on the mossy ground, thinking strange thoughts and dreaming strange dreams. The night of the first revelation was a sultry one. I must have fallen asleep from fatigue, for it was with a distinct sense of awakening that I heard the voices. Of those tones and accents I hesitate to speak, of their quality I will not speak, but I may say that they presented certain uncanny differences in vocabulary, pronunciation, and mode of utterance. Every shade of New England dialect, from the uncouth syllables of the Puritan colonists to the precise rhetoric of 50 years ago, seemed represented in that shadowy colloquy, though it was only later that I noticed the fact. At the time, indeed, my attention was distracted from this matter by another phenomenon, a phenomenon so fleeting that I could not take oath upon its reality. I barely fancied that as I awoke, a light had been hurriedly extinguished within the sunken sepulchre. I do not think I was either astounded or panic-stricken, but I know that I was greatly and permanently changed that night. Upon returning home, I went with much directness to a rotting chest in the attic, wherein I found the key, which the next day unlocked with ease the barrier I had so long stormed in vain. It was the soft glow of late afternoon that I first entered the vault on the abandoned slope. A spell was upon me, and my heart leaped with an exultation I can but ill describe. As I closed the door behind me and descended the dripping steps by the light of my lone candle, I seemed to know the way, and though the candle sputtered with the stiffening reek of the place, I felt strangely at home in the musty charnel house air. Looking about me, I beheld many marble slabs bearing coffins, or the remains of coffins. Some of these were sealed and intact, but others had nearly vanished, leaving the silver handles and plates isolated amongst certain curious heaps of whitish dust. Upon one plate I read the name of Sir Geoffrey Hyde, who had come from Sussex in 1640 and died here a few years later. In a conspicuous alcove was one fairly well preserved and untenanted casket, adorned with a single name which brought me both a smile and a shudder. An odd impulse caused me to climb upon the broad slab, extinguish my candle, and lie down within the vacant box. In the gray light of dawn I staggered from the vault and locked the chain of the door behind me. I was no longer a young man, though but 21 winters had chilled my bodily frame. Early rising villagers who observed my homeward progress looked at me strangely, and marveled at the signs of ribald revelry which they saw in one whose life was known to be sober and solitary. I did not appear before my parents till after a long and refreshing sleep. Henceforward I haunted the tomb each night, seeing, hearing, and doing things I must never reveal. My speech, always susceptible to environmental influences, was the first thing to succumb to the change, and my suddenly acquired archaism of diction was soon remarked upon. Later, a queer boldness and recklessness came into my demeanor. Still, I unconsciously grew to possess the bearing of a man of the world despite my lifelong seclusion. My formerly silent tongue waxed voluble with the easy grace of a Chesterfield or the godless cynicism of a Rochester. I displayed a particular erudition utterly unlike the fantastic monkish lore over which I had pored in my youth, and covered the fly-leaves of my books with facile impromptu epigrams, which brought up the suggestions of Gay, Prior, and the sprightliest of the Augustan wits and rhymesters. One morning at breakfast I came close to disaster by declaiming in a palpably liquorish accents an effusion of 18th century bacchanalian mirth, a bit of Georgian playfulness never recorded in a book, which ran something like this. Come hither, my lads, with your tankards of ale, and drink to the present before it shall fail. Pile each on your platter a mountain of beef, for 'tis eating and drinking that brings us relief. So fill up your glass, for life will soon pass. When you're dead, you'll never drink to your king or your lass. Anacreon had a red nose, so they say, but what's a red nose if you're happy and gay? Glad spit me, I'd rather be red whilst I'm here than white as a lily and dead half a year. So Betty, my lass, come give me a kiss. In hell there's no innkeeper's daughter like this. Young Harry, propped up as straight as he's able, will soon lose his wig and slip under the table. But fill up your goblets and pass 'em round, better under the table than under the ground. So revel and chaff, and ye thirstily quaff. Under 6 feet of dirt 'tis less easy to laugh. The fiends strike me blue, I'm scarce able to walk, and damn me if I can stand upright or talk. Here, landlord, bid Betty to summon a chair. I'll try home for a while, for my wife is not there. So lend me a hand, I'm not able to stand, but I'm gay whilst I linger on top of the land. About this time I conceived my present fear of fire and thunderstorms. Previously indifferent to such things, I had now an unspeakable horror of them. and would retire to the innermost recesses of the house whenever the heavens threatened an electrical display. A favorite haunt of mine during the day was the ruined cellar of the mansion that had burned down, and, in fancy, I would picture the structure as it had been in prime. On one occasion I startled a villager by leading him confidently to a shallow sub-cellar, of whose existence I seemed to know in spite of the fact that it had been unseen and forgotten for many generations. At last came that which I had long feared. My parents, alarmed at the altered manner and appearance of their only son, commenced to exert over my movements a kindly espionage, which threatened to result in a disaster. I had told no one of my visits to the tomb, having guarded my secret purpose with religious zeal since childhood, but now I was forced to exercise care in threading the mazes of the wooded hollow, that I might throw off a possible pursuer. My key to the vault I kept suspended from a cord about my neck, its presence known only to me. I never carried out of the sepulchre any of the things I came upon whilst within its walls. One morning, as I emerged from the damp tomb and fastened the chain of the portal with none too steady hand, I beheld in an ancient thicket the dreaded face of a watcher. Surely the end was near, for my bower was discovered, and the objective of my nocturnal journeys revealed. The man did not accost me, so I hastened home in an effort to overhear what he might report to my careworn father. Were my sojourns beyond the chained door about to be proclaimed to the whole world? Imagine my delighted astonishment upon hearing the spy inform my parent, in cautious whisper, that I had spent the night in the bower outside the tomb, my sleep-filmed eyes fixed upon the crevice where the padlocked portal stood ajar. By what miracle had the watcher been thus deluded? I was now convinced that a supernatural agency protected me. Made bold by this heaven-sent circumstance, I began to resume perfect openness in going to the vault, confident that no one could witness my entrance. For a week I tasted to the full the joys of that charnel conviviality which I must not describe, when the thing happened, and I was borne away to this accursed abode of sorrow and monotony. I should not have ventured out that night, for the taint of thunder was in the clouds, and the hellish phosphorescence rose from the rank swamp at the bottom of the hollow. The call of the dead, too, was different. Instead of the hillside tomb, it was the charred cellar on the crest of the slope whose presiding daemon beckoned to me with unseen fingers. As I emerged from an intervening grove upon the plain before the ruin, I beheld the misty moonlight, a thing I had always vaguely expected. The mansion, gone for a century, once more reared its stately height to the raptured vision, every window ablaze with the splendor of many candles. Up the long drive rolled the coaches of the Boston gentry, whilst on foot came a numerous assemblage of powdered exquisites from the neighboring mansions. With this throng I mingled, though I knew I belonged with the hosts rather than the guests. Inside the hall were music, laughter, and wine on every hand. Several faces I recognized, though I should have known them better had they been shriveled or eaten away by death and decomposition. Amidst a wild and reckless throng I was the wildest and most abandoned. Gay blasphemy poured in torrents from my lips, and in my shocking sallies I heeded no law of God, man, or nature. Suddenly a peal of thunder, resonant even above the din of the swinish revelry, cleaved the very roof that had laid a hush of fear upon the boisterous company. Red tongues of flame and searing gusts of heat engulfed the house, and the roysters, struck with terror at the descent of calamity which seemed to transcend the bounds of unguided nature, fled shrieking into the night. I alone remained, riveted to my seat by the groveling fear which I had never felt before. And then a second horror took possession of my soul. Burnt alive to ashes, my body dispersed by the four winds. I might never lie in the tomb of hides. Was not my coffin prepared for me? Had I not a right to rest till eternity amongst the descendants of Sir Geoffrey Hyde? Aye, I would claim my heritage of death, even though my soul goes seeking through the ages for another corporeal tenement to represent it on that vacant slab in the alcove of the vault. Jervis Hyde will never share the sad fate of Palnurus. As the phantom of the burning house faded, I found myself screaming and struggling madly in the arms of two men, one of whom was the spy who had followed me to the tomb. Rain was pouring down in torrents, and upon the southern horizon were flashes of the lightning that had so lately passed over our heads. My father, his face lined with sorrow, stood by as I shouted my demands to be laid within the tomb, frequently admonishing my captors to treat me as gently as they could. A blackened circle on the floor of that ruined cellar told of a violent strike from the heavens, and from this spot a group of curious villagers with lanterns were prying a small box of antique workmanship which the thunderbolt had brought to light. Ceasing my futile and now objectless writhing, I watched the spectators as they viewed the treasure trove, and was permitted to share in their discoveries. The box, whose fastenings were broken by the stroke which had unearthed it, contained many papers and objects of value. But I had eyes for one thing alone. It was the porcelain miniature of a young man in a smartly curled bagwig, and bore the initials J.H. The face was such that as I gazed, I might as well have been studying my mirror. On the following day I was brought to this room with the barred windows, but I have been kept informed of certain things through an aged and simple-minded servitor, for whom I bore a fondness in infancy, and who, like me, loves the churchyard. What I have dared relate to my experiences within the vault has brought me only pitying smiles. My father, who visits me frequently, declares that at no time did I pass the chained portal, and swears that the rusted padlock had not been touched for 50 years when he examined it. He even says that all the village knew of my journeys to the tomb, and that I was often watched as I slept in the bower outside the grim facade, my half-open eyes fixed on the crevice that leads to the interior. Again, these assertions I have no tangible proof to offer, since my key to the padlock was lost in the struggle on that night of horrors. The strange things of the past which I learnt during those nocturnal meetings with the dead diminishes as the fruits of my lifelong and omnivorous browsing amongst the ancient volumes of the family library. Had it not been for my old servant Hiram, I should have by this time become quite convinced of my madness. But Hiram, loyal to the last, has held faith in me, and has done that which impels me to make public at least a part of my story. A week ago he burst open the lock which chains the door of the tomb perpetually ajar, and descended with lantern into the murky depths. On a slab in an alcove he found an old but empty coffin, whose tarnished plate bears the single word, Jervis. In that coffin, and in that vault, they have promised me I shall be buried. Thus ends the tomb. This next story is the doom that This tale was written on December 3rd, 1919, and also betrays the influence of Lord Dunsay. Lovecraft thought he had found the name Sarnath in a work by Dunsay, but this is not the case. The use of the green idol Bokrug may be a tip of the hat to Dunsay's celebrated play, The Gods of the Mountain, 1914, where green jade gods made an appearance. The mention of a throne wrought of one piece of ivory is a clear nod to idle days on the Yann, where such a detail is cited. The story first appeared in the Scot, June 1920, a Scottish amateur journal. There is in the land of Nar a vast still lake that is fed by no stream, and out of which no stream flows. 10,000 years ago there stood by its shore the mighty city of Sarnath, but Sarnath stands there no more. It is told that in the immemorial years when the world was young, before ever the men of Sarnath came to the land of Nar, another city stood beside the lake, the grey stone city of Ib, which was old as the lake itself, and peopled with beings not pleasing to behold. Very odd and ugly were these beings, as indeed are most beings of a world yet inchoate and rudely fashioned. It is written on the brick cylinders of Cadethron that the beings of Ib were in hue as green as the lake, and the mists that rise above it, and that they had bulging eyes, pouting, flabby lips, and curious ears, and were without voice. It is also written that they descended one night from the moon in a mist, and they and the vast still lake and the grey stone city of Ib. However this may be, it is certain that they worshipped a sea-green stone idol, chiseled in the likeness of Bokrug, the great water lizard, before which they danced horribly when the moon was gibbous. And it is written in the papyrus of Ilarnak that they one day discovered fire, and thereafter kindled flames on many ceremonial occasions. But not much is written of these beings, because they lived in very ancient times, and man is young, and knows but little of the very ancient living things. After many aeons, men came to the land of Nar, dark shepherd folk with their fleecy flocks, who built Thra, Ilarnak, and Cadethron on the winding river Eye, and certain tribes, more hardy than the rest, pushed on to the border of the lake and built Sarnath, at a spot where precious metals were found in the earth. Not far from the grey city of Ib did the wandering tribes lay the first stones of Sarnath, and at the beings of Ib they marveled greatly, but with their marveling was mixed hate, for they thought it not meet that brings of such aspect should walk about the world of men at dusk, nor did they like the strange sculptures upon which the grey monoliths of Ib, for those sculptures were terrible with great antiquity. Why the beings and the sculptures lingered so late in the world, even till the coming of men, none can tell, unless it was because the land of Nar is very still and remote from most other lands, both of waking and of dream. As the men of Sarnath beheld more of the beings of Ib, their hate grew, and it was not less because they found their beings weak and soft as jelly to the touch of stones and spears and arrows. So one day the young warriors, the slingers and the spearmen and the bowmen, marched against Ib, and slew all the inhabitants thereof, pushing the queer bodies into the lake with long spears, because they did not wish to touch them, and because they do not like the grey sculpted monoliths of Ib, they cast these also into the lake, wondering from the greatness of the labor, however the stones were brought from afar, as they must have been, since there is not like them in all the land of Nar, or in the lands adjacent. Thus of the very ancient city of Ib was nothing spared, save the sea-green stone idol chiseled in the likeness of Bokrug, the water lizard. This the young warriors took back with them to Sarnath as a symbol of conquest over the old gods and the beings of Ib, and a sign of leadership in Nar. But on the night after it was set up in the temple, a terrible thing must have happened, for weird lights were seen over the lake, and in the morning the people found the idol gone, and the high priest Tarnanish lying dead, as if from some fear unspeakable. And before he died, Tarnanish had scrawled upon the altar of chrysolite with coarse, shaky strokes of the sign of doom. After Tarnan-ish there were many high priests in Sarnath, but never was the sea-green stone idol found. And many centuries came and went, wherein Sarnath prospered exceedingly, so that only priests and old women remembered what Tarnan-ish had scrawled upon the altar of chrysolite. Betwixt Sarnath and the city of Ilnarik arose a caravan route, and the precious metals from the earth were exchanged for other metals and rare cloths and jewels and books and tools for artificers and all things of luxury that are known to the people who dwell along the winding river Ai and beyond. So Sarnath waxed mightily and learned and beautiful, and sent forth conquering armies to subdue the neighboring cities, and in time there sate upon a throne in Sarnath the kings of all the land of Nar and of many lands adjacent. The wonder of the world and the pride of all mankind was Sarnath the Magnificent. Of polished, desert-quarried marble were its walls, in height 300 cubits and in breadth 75, so that chariots might pass each other as men drave them along the top. For full 500 stadia did they run, being open only on the side toward the lake, where a green stone sea wall kept back the waves that rose oddly once a year at the festival of the destroying of Ib. In Sarnath were 50 streets from the lake to the gates of the caravans, and 50 more intersecting them. With onyx were they paved, save those whereon the horses and camels and elephants trod. Were paved with granite. And the gates of Sarnath were as many as the landward ends of the streets, each of bronze, and flanked by the figures of lions and elephants, carven from some stone no longer known among men. The houses of Sarnath were glazed brick and chalcedony, each having its walled garden and crystal lakelet. With strange art were they builded, for no other city had houses like them, and travelers from Thra and Ilarnek and Cadatheron marveled at the shining domes wherein they were surmounted. But more marvelous still were the places and the temples and the gardens made by Zokar the olden king. There were many places, the least of which were mightier than any in Thra or Ilarnek or Cadathion. So high were they that one within might sometimes fancy himself beneath only the one sky. Yet when lighted with torches dipped in the oil of Dothr, their walls showed vast paintings of kings and armies, of splendor at once inspiring and stupefying to the beholder. Many were the pillars of the palaces, all of tinted marble, and carven into designs of surpassing beauty, and in most of the places the floors were mosaics of beryl and lapis lazuli, and sardonyx and carbuncle, and other choice materials, so disposed that the beholder might fancy himself walking over beds of the rarest flowers. And there were likewise fountains, which cast scented waters about in pleasing jets arranged with cunning art. Outshining all others was the palace of the kings of Mnar and of the lands adjacent. On a pair of golden crouching lions rested the throne, many steps above the gleaming floor, and it was wrought of one piece of ivory, though no man lives who knows whence so vast peace could have come. In that place there were also many galleries, and many amphitheaters where lions and men and elephants battled at the pleasure of the kings. Sometimes the amphitheaters were flooded with water conveyed from the lake in mighty aqueducts, and then were enacted stirring sea fights or combats betwixt swimmers and deadly marine things. Lofty and amazing were the 17 tower-like temples of Sarnath, fashioned of a bright multicolored stone not known elsewhere. A full 1,000 cubits high stood the greatest among them, wherein the high priest dwelt with a magnificence scarce less than that of the kings. On the ground were halls as vast and splendid as those of the palaces, where gathered throngs in worship of Zokalar, and Tamash and Loban, the chief gods of Sarnath, whose incense enveloped shrines were as the thrones of monarchs. Not like the icons of other gods were those of Zokalar and Tamash and Loban, for so close to life were they that one might swear the graceful bearded gods themselves sate on the ivory thrones, and up unending steps of shining zircon was the tower chamber, wherefrom the high priest looked out over the city and the plains and the lake by day, and at the cryptic moon and significant stars and planets and their reflections in the lake by night. Here was done the very secret and ancient rite and detestation of Bukrug, the water lizard, and here rested the altar of chrysolite, which bore the doom scrawl of Tarnan-Ish. Wonderful likewise were the gardens made by Zokar, the olden king. In the center of Sarnath they lay, covering a great space encircled by a high wall, and they were surmounted by a mighty dome of glass, through which shone the sun and moon and stars and planets when it was clear. And from which were hung fulgent images of the sun and moon and stars and planets when it was not clear. In summer the gardens were cooled with fresh odorous breezes skillfully wafted by fans, and in winter they were heated with concealed fires, so that in those gardens it was always spring. There ran little streams over bright pebbles, dividing meads of green and gardens of many hues, and spanned by a multitude of bridges. Many were the waterfalls in their courses, and many were the lilied lakelets into which they expanded. Over the streams and lakelets rose white swans, whilst the music of rare birds chimed in with the melody of the waters. In ordered terraces rose the green banks, adorned here and there with bowers of vines and sweet blossoms, and seats and benches of marble and porphyry. And there were many small shrines and temples where one might rest or pray to the two small gods. No problem. Each year there was celebrated in Sarnath the feast of the destroying of Ib, at which time wine, song, dancing, and merriment of every kind abounded. Great honors were paid to the shades of those who had annihilated the odd ancient beings, and the memory of those beings and their elder gods was derided by dancers and lutanists crowned with roses from the gardens of Zokar, and the kings would look out over the lake and curse the bones of the dead that lay beneath it, At first the high priest liked not the festivals, for there had descended amongst them queer tales of how sea-green Ichion had vanished, and how Tarnan Ish had died from fear and left a warning. And they said that from their high tower they sometimes saw lights beneath the waters of the lake. But as many years passed without calamity, even the priests laughed and cursed and joined in the orgies and feasters. Indeed, they had not themselves in their high tower often performed the very ancient and secret rite in dissertation of Bokrog, the water lizard, and 1,000 years of riches and delight passed over Sarnath, wonder of the world and pride of all mankind. Gorgeous beyond thought was the feast of the 1,000th year of the destroying of Ib. For a decade had it been talked of and in the land of Mnar. As it drew nigh, there came to Sarnath on horses and camels and elephants men from Thra, Ilarnek, and Caladetheron, and all the cities of Nar and lands beyond. Before the marble walls on the appointed night were pitched the pavilions of princes and the tents and travelers, and all the shore resounded with the song of happy revelers. Within his banquet hall reclined Nagras-Hi, the king, drunken with ancient wine from the vaults of conquered Nath, and surrounded by feasting nobles and hurrying slaves. There were eaten many strange delicacies at that feast, peacocks from the isles of Nariel in the middle ocean, young goats from the distant hills of Implan, heels of camels from the Nazak Desert, nuts and spices from Sindathrian groves, and pearls from white wave-washed tal, dissolved in the vinegar of Thra. Of sauces there were an untold number, prepared by the subtlest cooks in all Mnar, and suited to the palate of every feaster. The most prized of all, the viands, were the great fishes from the lake, each of vast size, and served up on golden platters set with rubies and diamonds. Whilst the king and his nobles feasted within the palace and viewed the crowning dish as it awaited them on golden platters, others feasted elsewhere. In the tower of the great temple the priests held revels, and in pavilions without the walls the princes of neighboring lands made merry. And it was the high priest Naika who first saw the shadows that descended from the gibbous moon into the lake, and the damnable green mists that arose from the lake to meet the moon, and to shroud in a sinister haze the towers and domes of fated Sarnath. Thereafter rose in the towers and without the walls, beheld strange lights on the tower, and saw that the grey rock Akurion, which was wont to rear high above it near the shore, was almost submerged, and fear grew vaguely yet swiftly, so that the princes of Ilnarik and Far Rokal took down and folded their tents and pavilions and departed for the river Ai, though they scarce knew the reason for their departing. Then, close to the hour of midnight, all the bronze gates of Sarnath burst open and emptied forth a frenzied throng that blackened the plain, so that all the visiting princes and travelers fled away in fright. For on the faces of this throng was writ a madness born of horror unendurable, and on their tongues were words so terrible that no hearer paused for proof. Men whose eyes were wild with fear shrieked aloud of the sight within the king's banquet hall, where through the windows were seen no longer the forms of Nagras-Hay and his nobles and slaves, but a horde of indescribable green voiceless things with bulging eyes, pouting flabby lips, and curious ears, things which danced horribly, bearing in their paws golden platters set with rubies and diamonds containing uncouth flames. And the princes and travelers, as they fled from their city of Sarnath on horses and camels and elephants, looked again upon the mist-begetting lake, and saw the grey rock Akurion was quite submerged. Though all the land of Nar and the lands adjacent spread the tales of those who had fled from Sarnath, and caravans sought that accursed city and its precious metals no more, it was long ere any traveller went thither, and even then only the brave and adventurous young men of distant Falona dared make the journey. Adventurous young men of yellow hair and blue eyes, who are no kin to the man of Nar. These men indeed went to the lake to view Sarnath, but though they found the vast still lake itself, and the grey rock, Akurion, which rears high above it near the shore, they beheld not the wonder of the world and pride of all mankind. Where once had risen walls of 300 cubits and towers yet higher, now stretched only the marshy shore, and where once had dwelt 50 millions of men, now crawled only the detestable green water lizard. Not even the mines of precious metal remained, for doom had come to Sarnath. But half buried in the rushes was spied a curious green idol of stone, an exceedingly ancient idol coated with seaweed and chiseled in the likeness of Bakrug, the great water lizard. That idol, enshrined in the high temple at Ilaranek, was subsequently worshipped beneath the gibbous moon throughout the land of Nar. Thus ends the doom that came to Sarnath. This next story is the statement of Randolph Carter. I believe after this one, I'm going to go have some dinner. I hope you all enjoy it. This story, as is well known, is an almost exact transcript of a dream that Lovecraft had in December 1919, as recorded in a letter of December 11th. In the dream, however, the setting seems to be New England. In the story, Lovecraft has apparently transferred the locale to Florida. If the mentions of the Gainesville Pike and Big Cypress Swamp are any indication, Lovecraft introduces Randolph Carter in this tale, his colleague, Henry Warren, as a stand-in for Samuel Loveman, poet and amateur journalist who figured in Lovecraft's dream. Lovecraft also introduces the element of the forgotten book. The story first appeared in The Vagrant, May 1920. Randolph Carter is also essentially the self-insert of H.P. Lovecraft. I repeat to you, gentlemen, that your inquisition is fruitless. Detain me here forever, if you will. Confine me or execute me if you must have a victim to propagate the illusion you call justice. But I can say no more that I have said already. Everything that I can remember I have told with perfect candor. Nothing has been distorted or concealed. And if any things remain vague, it is only because of the dark cloud which has come over my mind. That cloud and the nebulous nature of the horrors which brought it upon me. Again, I say, I do not know what has become of Harley Warren, though I think, almost hope, that he is in peaceful oblivion, if there be anywhere so blessed a thing. It is true that I have for 5 years been his closest friend and partial sharer of his terrible researches into the unknown. I will not deny, though my memory is uncertain and indistinct, that this witness of yours may have seen us together, as he says, on the Gainesville Pike, walking toward Big Cypress Swamp. Let's spell it. 11:30 on that awful night that we bore electric lanterns, spades, and a curious coil of wire with attached instruments, I will even affirm. But these things all played a part in the single hideous scene which remains burned into my shaken recollection. But of what followed, and of the reason that I was found alone and dazed on the edge of the swamp next morning, I must insist that I know nothing, save what I have told you over and over again. You say to me that there is nothing in the swamp or near it which could form the setting of that frightful episode. I reply that I know nothing beyond what I saw. Vision or nightmare it may have been. Vision or nightmare I fervently hope it was. Yet it is all that my mind retains of what took place in those shocking hours after we left the sight of men, and why Harley Warren did not return, he or his shade, or some nameless thing I cannot describe, alone can tell. As I have said before, the weird studies of Harley Warren were well known to me, and to some extent shared by me. Of his vast collection of strange, rare books on forbidden subjects, I have read all that are written in the languages of which I am master. But these are few as compared with those in languages I cannot understand. Most, I believe, are in Arabic, and the fiend-inspired book which brought on the end, the book which he carried in his pocket out of the world, was written in characters whose like I never saw elsewhere. Warren would never tell me just what was in that book. As to the nature of our studies, I must say again, I no longer retain full comprehension. It seems to me rather merciful that I do not, for they were terrible studies which I pursued more through reluctant fascination than through actual inclination. One just followed. I don't know where that came from. For some reason it didn't show up on my activity. Oh well. Oh, somewhere. Anyway, to continue. Warren always dominated me, and sometimes I feared him. I remember how I shuddered at his facial expression on the night before the awful happening, when he talked so incessantly of his theory, why certain corpses never decay, but rest firm and fat in their tombs for 1,000 years. But I do not fear him now, for I suspect that he has known horrors beyond my ken. Now I fear for him. Once more I say that I have no clear idea of our object on that night. Certainly it has much to do with something in the book which Warren carried with him, that ancient book of undecipherable characters which had come to him from India a month before. But I swear I do not know what it was we expected to find. Your witness says he saw us at 11:30 on the Gainesville Pike, headed for Big Cypress Swamp. This is probably true, but I have no distinct memory of it. The picture seared into my soul is of one scene only, and the hour must have been long after midnight, for a wanting crescent moon was high in the vaporous heavens. The place was an ancient cemetery, so ancient that I trembled at the manifold signs of immemorial years. It was in a deep, damp hollow, overgrown with rank grass, moss, and curious creeping weeds, and filled with a vague stench, which my idle fancy associated absurdly with rotting stone. On every hand were signs of neglect and decrepitude, and I seemed haunted by the notion that Warren and I were the first living creatures to invade a lethal silence of centuries. Over the valley's rim, a wan, waning crescent moon peered through the noisome vapors that seemed to emanate from an unheard of catacombs, and by its feeble, wavering beams I could distinguish a repellent array of antique slabs, urns, and cenotaphs, and mausolean facades, all crumbling, moss-grown, and moisture-stained, and partially concealed by the gross luxuriance of the unearthly vegetation. My first vivid impression of my own presence in this terrible necropolis concerns the act of pausing with Warren before a certain half-obliterated sepulchre, and throwing down some burdens which we seemed to have been carrying. I now observed that I had with me an electric lantern and 2 spades, whilst my companion was supplied with a similar lantern and a portable telephone outfit. chat, I'm back. Let me see now. Where was I at? The place was an ancient cemetery, so ancient that I trembled at the manifold signs of immemorial years. It was in a deep, damp hollow, overgrown with rank grass, moss, and curious creeping weeds, and filled with a vague stench which my idle fancy associated absurdly with rotting stone. On every hand were signs of neglect and decrepitude. Yes, mister, if you're still there, I apologize. For some reason, OBS... There we are. We're stopping that. There we go. Sorry. Doubling up on the audio. And I seemed haunted by the notion that Warren and I were the first living creatures to invade a lethal silence of centuries. Over the valley's rim, a wan, waning crescent moon peered through the noisome vapors that seemed to emanate from unheard-of catacombs, and by its feeble, wavering beams I could distinguish a repellent array of antique slabs, urns, cenotaphs, and mausolean facades, all crumbling, moss-grown, and moisture-stained, and partially concealed by the gross luxuriance of the unhealthy vegetation. My first vivid impression of my own presence in this terrible necropolis concerns the act of pausing with Warren before a certain half-obliterated sepulchre, and of throwing down some burdens which we seemed to have been carrying. I now observed that I had with me an electric lantern and 2 spades, whilst my companion was supplied with a similar lantern and portable telephone outfit. No word was uttered, for the spot and the task seemed known to us, and without delay we seized our spades and commenced to clear away the grass, weeds, and drifted earth from the flat, archaic mortuary. After uncovering the entire surface, which consisted of 3 immense granite slabs, we stepped back some distance to survey the charnel scene, and Warren appeared to make some mental calculations. Then he returned to the sepulchre, and using his spade as a lever, sought to pry up the slab lying nearest to a stony ruin which may have been a monument in its day. He did not succeed, and motioned to me to come to his assistance. Finally, our combined strength loosened the stone, which we raised and tipped to one side. The removal of the slab revealed a black aperture, from which rushed an effluence of miasmal gases so nauseous that we started back in horror. After an interval, however, we approached the pit again, and found the exhalations less unbearable. Our lanterns disclosed the top of a flight of stone steps, dripping with some detestable ichor in the inner earth, and bordered by moist walls encrusted with nitrate. And now, for the first time in my memory, records verbal discourse, Warren addressing me at length in his mellow tenor voice, a voice singularly unperturbed by our awesome surroundings. I'm sorry to ask you to stay on the surface, he said. But it wouldn't be a crime to let anyone with your frail nerves go down there. You can't imagine, even from what you have read and what I've told you, the things I shall have to see and do. It's fiendish work, Carter, and I doubt if any man without ironclad sensibilities could ever see it through and come up alive and sane. I don't wish to offend you, and heaven knows I'd be glad enough to have you with me. But the responsibility is a certain sense mine. I couldn't drag a bundle of nerves like you down to probable death or madness. I tell you, you can't imagine what the thing is really like, but I promise to keep you informed over the telephone of every move. You see, I've Enough wire here to reach the center of the earth and back. I can still hear in memory those coolly spoken words, and can still remember my remote remonstrances. I seemed desperately anxious to accompany my friend into those sepulchral depths, yet he proved inflexibly obdurate. At one time he threatened to abandon the expedition. I remained insistent, a threat which provided effective, since he alone held the key to the thing. All this I can still remember, although I no longer know what manner of thing we sought. After he had secured my reluctant acquiescence in his design, Warren picked up the reel of wire and adjusted the instruments. At his nod, I took one of the ladder and sated myself upon an aged, discolored gravestone close to the newly uncovered aperture. Then he shook my hand, shouldered the coil of wire, and disappeared within that indescribable ossuary. For a moment I kept sight of the glow of his lantern, and heard the rustle of the wire as he laid it down after him. But the glow soon disappeared abruptly, as if a turn in the stone staircase had been encountered, and the sound died away almost as quickly. I was alone, yet bound to the unknown depths by those magic strands, whose insulated surface lay green beneath the struggling beams of that waning crescent moon. In the lone silence of that hoary and deserted city of the dead, my mind conceived the most ghastly fantasies and illusions, and the grotesque shrines and monoliths seemed to assume a hideous personality, a half-sentience. Amorphous shadows seemed to lurk in the darker depths, in the darker recesses of the weed-choked hollow, and to fit in, as in some blasphemous ceremonial procession, past the portals of the moldering tombs on the hillside, shadows which could not have been cast by that pallid, peering crescent moon. I constantly consulted my watch by the light of my electric lantern, and listened with feverish anxiety at the receiver of the telephone, but for more than a quarter of an hour heard nothing. Then a faint clicking came from the instrument, and I called down to my friend in a tense voice. Apprehensive as I was nevertheless unprepared for the words which came up from that uncanny vault in accents more alarmed and quivering than any I had heard before from Harley Warren. He who had so calmly left me a little while previously now called from below in a shaky whisper, more portentous than the loudest shriek. "God, if you could see what I'm seeing!" I could not answer. Speechless, I could only wait. Then came the frenzied tones again. "Carter, it's terrible! Monstrous! Unbelievable!" This time my voice did not fail me, and I poured into the transmitter a flood of excited questions. Terrified, I continued to repeat, "Warren, what is it? What is it?" Once more came the voice of my friend, still hoarse with fear, and now apparently tinged with despair. "I can't tell you, Carter. It's too utterly beyond thought. I dare not tell you. No man should know of it and live. Great God, I never dreamed of this!" Stillness again, save for my now incoherent touring of stuttering inquiry. Then the voice of Warren in a pitch of wilder consternation. "Carter, for the love of God, put the slab and get out of this if you can! Quick, leave everything else and make it for the outside! It's your only chance! Do as I say, and don't ask me to explain!" I heard, yet was able only to repeat my frantic questions. Around me were the tombs and the darkness and the shadows. Below me some peril beyond the radius of the human imagination. My friend was in greater danger than I, and through my fear, I felt a vague resentment that he should deem me capable of deserting him under such circumstances. More clicking, and after a pause, a piteous cry from Warren. "Beat it! For God's sake! Put the slab back and beat it, Carter!" Something in the boyish slang of my evidently stricken companion unleashed my faculties. I formed and shouted a resolution. "Warren, brace up! I'm coming down!" But this offer, the tone of my auditor, changed to a scream of utter despair. "Don't! You can't understand! It's too late! And my own fault! Put back the slab and run! There's nothing else you or anyone can do now!" The tone changed again, this time acquiring a softer quality, as of hopeless resignation. Yet it remained tense, though anxiety for me. "Quick, before it's too late!" I tried not to heed him, tried to break through the paralysis which held me, and to fulfill my vow to rush down to his aid. But his next whisper found me still inert in the chains of stark horror. "Carter, hurry! It's no use! You must go! Better one than two! The slab!" Pause, more clicking, then the faint voice of Warren. "Nearly over now. Don't make it harder. Cover up those damned steps and run. For your life. You're losing time. So long, Carter. Won't see you again." Here Warren's whispers swelled into a cry that gradually rose to a shriek fraught with all the horror of the ages. "Curse these hellish things! Legions! My God! Beat it! Beat it! Beat it!" After that was silence. I know not how many interminable aeons I sat stupefied, whispering, muttering, calling, screaming into that telephone. Over and over again, through those aeons, I whispered and muttered and called, shouted and screamed. "Warren! Warren! Answer me! Are you there?" And then there came to me the crowning horror of all, the unbelievable, unthinkable, almost unmentionable thing. I have said that eons seemed to elapse after Warren shrieked forth his last desperate warning, and that only my cries now broke the hideous silence. But after a while there was a further clicking in the receiver. I strained my ears to listen again. Again I called down, "Warren, are you there?" And in answer heard the thing which has brought this cloud over my mind. I do not try, gentlemen, to account for that thing, that voice, nor can I venture to describe it in detail, since the first words took away my consciousness and created a mental blank which reaches to the depth of time of my awakening in the hospital. Shall I say that the voice was deep, hollow, gelatinous, remote, unearthly, inhuman, disembodied? What shall I say? It was the end of my experience, and this is the end of my story. I heard it and knew no more. Heard it as I sat petrified in that unknown cemetery in the hollow, amidst the crumbling stones and the falling tombs, the rank vegetation and the miasmal vapors. Heard it well up from the innermost depths of that damnable open sepulchre as I watched amorphous necrophagus shadows dance beneath an accursed waning moon. And this is what it said. "You fool, Warren is dead." Thus ends the statement of Randolph Carter. Well, I want to thank you all for listening. I am going to go have some dinner. Sorry for the earlier scuff, but we are going to see who we can raid. Usually I do people that I'm following. Let's see if I can send you over to Vampy Kids. She's playing some Hobby Playtime. So, a little more horror for your Friday near the end of January. Again, want to thank you all for coming out, and I will see you next time. Goodbye for now. Shh. Dang it, I can't raid Vampy. Unable to raid it this time. Well, that's unfortunate. Um, let's try Metal Mikey. He's playing a boxing game.